The sun was in the process of setting, and light was low in the little canyon as Three Bears pulled the unconscious medicine man from the sweat lodge. Crooked Eye had sweated out, finally wilting in the heat. Three Bears studied him for a moment as he lay on the canyon floor. He had thought about leaving Crooked Eye in the steam to see if it would kill him, but he had finally decided against it. The death might anger Sharp Elbow. Besides, that is too easy, Three Bears said, as he threw what was left of the cool water on the shaman. He leaned down and smacked the supine man's face until his eyelids fluttered. Crooked Eye looked up at Three Bears' ugly face, and the reality of his situation came back to him. He wished he could go back to sleep. "Welcome back, One Eye," Three Bears said. Then he felt someone approaching the lodge and turned around. Three Bears cursed in his head, wondering how such a big man could move so quietly. It was like Sharp Elbow was always practicing sneaking up on a person. "Sit him up, Three Bears, and leave me to talk with him," Sharp Elbow said. Three Bears resented being ordered around, but the tone of Sharp Elbow's voice told him that now was not a good time to let those feelings out. He pulled Crooked Eye up by an arm and left. Sharp Elbow looked at the florid, naked man that sat at his feet. A trickle of blood flowed down the right side of his face. The scab that had covered part of the man's cheek must have softened and rubbed off when he was dragged from the lodge. He was not a strong man, this shaman. Indeed, he did not even look like he had the strength to dress himself. "Your clothes are in a pile beside the lodge when you have recovered yourself enough to want them." The wilted man looked up at him, but kept silent. "My brother has gotten worse. What have you learned in your solitude and prayer?" "That steam can kill you, and Three Bears is the packhole of a horse." "A way was not shown to me. I must continue to fast and pray through tonight and tomorrow." Crooked Eye's own voice sounded strange to him. It lacked the sureness he usually managed to put in it. "It has been suggested to me that you may be wasting time," Sharp Elbow said slowly. "Curse you, Three Bears." "I stayed in the lodge until it nearly killed me. That no way was shown me to petition the spirits, I cannot help." "My brother is dying, shaman. You may have already guessed that if he dies, you die. So you will make your sacrifice tomorrow." Sharp Elbow pulled the big, double-edged knife he carried. Crooked Eye saw that it had 2 pieces of jawbone tied to the handle, and it was adorned with quills, feathers, and teeth. It was a bear knife, worth many horses, and once you paid for the knife, it was custom for the previous owner to throw it at you with deadly aim. If you caught it and lived, the knife was said to give you great power. This dangerous ritual was the only way to get one, besides stealing one or taking one off a fallen man. Crooked Eye was sure Sharp Elbow had gotten his by one of these last 2 ways. "I see you are admiring my blade," Sharp Elbow said. "Well, I like it too, and I like to use it. You will make your offering of flesh tomorrow, shaman, one way or another, and if you do not find a way to help White Hand, I will bury you to the neck." The tall man squatted so that he was level with the naked man. "And I will cut your hair with this." He held the bare knife in front of the seated man's face. "The bugs and birds will eat their way to that useless brain of yours that could not think of a way to help my brother." Sharp Elbow forced Crooked Eye to look at him, as if the shaman did not know that he meant what he said. The tall man stood up and left. Typical of a killer and a bully to think that threats will help resolve the situation, Crooked Eye thought, as he rose to get his clothes. Doesn't he know that he is just making my task harder than it already is? But he agreed with Sharp Elbow. He had to do something soon if White Hand had gotten worse. Time was not his friend. Crooked Eye felt eyes on him and saw that Gopher Boy was watching him dress. The young crow had apparently been named to guard him again. The man walked up to him with a smirk on his face, studying his member in an undisguised fashion. "That's not a bad medicine rattle, shaman," the crow said. "Can you cure what ails me with it?" "This just keeps getting better," Crooked Eye thought bitterly. "Not only do I have to pass the night thinking of a way to torture myself tomorrow, now I also have to pass it knowing that this ankle grabber wants to abuse me in other ways." Crooked Eye walked for the part of the canyon that had the most people in it without answering Gopher Boy's question. White Hand indeed looked worse the next morning. His breath came with a wheeze now, and he looked extremely weak. Crooked Eye was already weary when he spoke. "Today will be bright and clear, White Hand. Today I will dance for the sun to ask that you be spared." "How came you to the sun dance?" White Hand asked. Crooked Eye looked at Sharp Elbow before speaking to the dying man again. "This answer was before my face all the time, but as you know, sometimes the answer has to come of itself. In the sun dance, those who are to dance the Akipa are first captured, bound, and abused in mock fashion. Well, all these things have been done to me for real. So when I dance for you today, the power of the thing will be much greater than the summertime ritual the people do. Today Natosi will shine on you, White Hand, and a way will be shown for me to help you. Take heart." Crooked Eye had found his sure voice again, and saw by White Hand's eyes that he was responding to it. But he himself felt weak, tired, and fearful. At least Gopher Boy had left him alone, but so did Sleep. He did not feel ready for a brisk walk, let alone the sun dance. He had spent the night thinking, and settled on the Okipa because, as far as he knew, nobody had ever died from it. He had heard of men who cut off their fingers and died because poison got in the holes. These men died horribly, their prayers left unanswered. The same thing sometimes happened to those that skinned themselves. "I must go now to further prepare myself," Crooked Eye said. White Hand actually took his hand in gratitude. "A dying man will hold on to whatever he can," Crooked Eye thought, before turning to leave White Hand's grotto. "No, only 3 men can go with me. 1 for the earth, 1 for the sky, and 1 for the waters. I will be for the sun." 21 people were gathered around White Hand's cave, and all of them wanted to see the sun torture. By Crooked Eye's count, 7 of them were women. The shaman wanted none of them to gain enjoyment out of his sufferings. He also didn't want to have a bunch of people see him act unmanly, if it came to that. So he quickly thought up a compromise. "The medicine in the canyon is bad. Also, when the sun begins to go down, I will be in the shadows. I must perform the ritual up there." Crooked Eye pointed to the cliff that rose opposite the cave. "All can watch, but only 3 may accompany me on high, where the sun will be bright." Crooked Eye saw that once White Hand knew he would get the watch, he did not care what the others thought. "So be it," he said, loud enough for all to hear. The medicine man nodded and walked toward the cottonwood pole that some men had cut that morning. The pole was at least twice as tall as he was, and a little smaller around than his waist. Here and there on the otherwise smooth wood were knobs where limbs had been hacked off, and at the top was a deep groove where 2 rawhide cords had been tied. They were wound around the pole. Crooked Eye shuddered before looking away. He stripped off his leggings, shirt, and moccasins. As he stood in his breechcloth, 2 men painted him white all over and then marked him with black dots on his limbs and under his eyes. One of them drew a dark crescent moon on his forehead. Thin leafy limbs were tied around his wrists and ankles. Sharp Elbow walked up leading a well-worn horse, while Three Bears picked up the notched end of the pole, and Droslow joined them together with a braided rawhide rope. Crooked Eye did not dispute the choice of his original captors as his helpers. At least he had managed to keep the crowd down to 3. He turned and bowed his head toward White Hand's cave. Then the 4 of them headed for higher ground. The cottonwood pole made a steady dragging noise, interrupted by an occasional clunk, as the old sorrel dragged it up the rocky incline and out of the canyon. Droslow led the horse, and Three Bears carried a calf-skin bundle. Sharp Elbow walked beside the unwilling initiate-to-be, carrying a trade musket. Crooked Eye stole a peek behind him and saw that the other 2 men were likewise armed. He hadn't noticed before because their flintlocks were swung around their backs, hung there by plain leather slings. He also had other things on his mind. The sun was already warm and high in the sky. The 4 men took a turn to the right as their climb was finally finished. The ground before them was covered in spring grasses and spare patches of early blooming flowers. Further north, the land fell away sharply, and Crooked Eye could see that it rose again slowly. His vision prevented him from catching sight of that distant creek where the renegades got their water. By the time his eye reached that far, the land became a homogeneous blur to him, full of light colors that eventually blended into nothingness. He could see down into the canyon on the right, though. The people there were all assembled in a little crowd. Most of them were seated. Sharp Elbow raised his gun sideways in salute, and his older brother waved back. The sight of the dying man brought it all back for Crooked Eye. He had been wandering in a dream state, and the silence of his escorts had allowed him to stay there, but now his heart began to beat faster and he broke into a cold sweat. When faced with unpleasantness in the past, he had always been able to look beyond his present circumstance. But those times he was sure he would have something to look to. How could he do that now, when most likely the end of his misery would be an even more miserable death? For one of the few times in his life, Crooked Eye's mind went blank with terror. The party of men halted, and Droslow unhitched the pole before leading the horse to a scrub bush and tying him to it. Sharp Elbow drew his bare knife and handed it blade first to Crooked Eye. "Dig the hole. It will give you something to do besides scowl." Sharp Elbow looked at Three Bears. "You and I will get the rocks. He isn't going anywhere." The tall man nodded at the shaman. Crooked Eye didn't bother to point out that an initiate in the Sundance would never be forced to dig a hole. He dropped to one knee and poured his frustration and hopelessness into stabbing the ground. He stopped long enough to look at the cliff and contemplated throwing himself off of it. The fall would not be a long one. With my luck, I would probably survive the fall long enough to die an even slower death, he said to himself. He knew he was too afraid of dying to have nerve enough to jump, but, in thought anyway, it seemed like a good idea. The white man with the black dots straightened his head and continued to dig. Crooked Eye finished the hole about the same time the other men had built up a big pile of rocks beside it. "You two raise the pole and we will throw in the rocks. Give me my knife, shaman." Sharp Elbow held out a hand. The other one held his flintlock along his leg. Crooked Eye scraped off the caked dirt from the blade and handed it to him, butt first. Three Bears and Droslo put the heavy end of the beam in the hole and raised the pole upright. They stood on opposite sides of each other and kept it in balance while Sharp Elbow and Crooked Eye threw rocks in the hole. It was almost as deep as a man's leg, so it took some time, but before long they were stamping dirt over top the rocks. Three Bears picked up his bundle and said, "Well, shaman, maybe all that work will help deaden the pain." Sharp Elbow gave the squat man a look that would wilt a briar bush. Crooked Eye thought the big man had warned the other two to be serious, and that was why his captors had been so silent. Silent or not, he knew the pain would be the same. Crooked Eye positioned himself with his face to the sun. "Have you anything to say, shaman?" Sharp Elbow asked. What was there to say? "Please don't do this. Let me go. My blood will not keep your brother from dying." "I have nothing to say," Crooked Eye said, as firmly as he could. He watched Three Bears unroll his bundle on the ground and produce a long metal arrowhead, the point of which had been ground to needle sharpness. "Droslo?" The gangly man stepped forward and took the flesh of Crooked Eye's right breast just above the nipple between his thumb and forefinger. He pulled hard and steadily until he could pull no more. Three Bears looked at the flap of skin pulled away from Crooked Eye's chest and then looked up with gleaming eyes. "Thin or thick?" he said, barely managing to keep the mockery out of his voice. Crooked Eye knew that traditionally, if a man said thick, he was pierced thinly, but that knowledge was useless here. He saw by his tormentor's eyes that he would be lucky if Three Bears didn't stick the arrow needle beneath his ribs. The medicine man looked at Three Bears with hatred as an answer. Then he looked straight at the pole and waited. When he felt the pain hit him, he did not cry out, but his knees buckled slightly. Droslo actually pulled him back up by his now bloody chest. Three Bears went to his bundle again and produced a wooden skewer, blunted on both ends and about as long as a middle finger. When he forced the too thick skewer through the hole the arrowhead had made, Crooked Eye could not help but gasp and cry out. He managed to quiet his mouth, but it was lucky his stomach was empty because he might have ended up wearing its contents. The queasy sensation he felt was strong enough to be heard over the screaming and shouting pains of his chest. Droslo let go of his chest, and Crooked Eye made the mistake of looking down at the wood embedded in him. He forced himself to do it because he knew he would have to get used to the idea of being so impaled. But it was too soon. He saw the squiggly white tissue mixed with his blood on the end of the skewer where it had been pushed through, and the strands of fat became fly worms that squirmed frantically. Panic filled him, and he took a half a step before Sharp Elbow seized him by an arm. "Do not be a coward now. You and your kind have helped put men through worse. Think of that, and remember my promise." The renegade squeezed his upper arm with added strength until Crooked Eye regained control of himself. The man released him and nodded to the other two outlaws. Soon Crooked Eye had a matching pair of skewers stuck in his chest, and the white on the front of him became mingled with sacred red. Sinew was attached to both ends of the wooden pegs, and the cords on the pole were tied to the middle of the strands of sinew. Crooked Eye was now tethered to the cottonwood. His stomach and legs were weak, his head was fuzzy, and his eyes leaked in silent agony. He took a shuddery deep breath and did what was expected of him. He stood on his toes and leaned back until the cords pulled tight, the skin of his chest stretched out in demented mockery of a woman's breasts. The stabbing and shooting pains were intensified and joined by an awful, hot, tearing sensation. Crooked Eye raised his quavering voice. Hear me, O son! Hear the servant of pain! Hear the voice of one near death! I seek your guidance and your wisdom. You are the constant one, the comer and goer of whom time means nothing. In blood I cry out your name. In blood I gaze upon your eye. In blood I seek answers hidden from men's eyes. In blood I ask for the sight. Son, you are above all and you see all. Our comings and goings are open to your eye. No one can hide from you. No one can close your eye but you. I wear your bride upon my brow. Join her now, and conceive with her the answer I seek. Crooked Eye, hanging by his chest and rocking on his toes, said many such words in his pain and fear. Time passed, and he finally stopped moving and just stood. It became all he could do to keep his feet. His voice had become a croak, and the escorts he had become oblivious to were squatting or leaning on their guns. Sharp Elbow had gained respect for the shaman. The man had spoken well, in spite of his early terror and the suffering that followed. Who knows, maybe a spirit would speak to the shaman. Maybe his brother would be spared. Crooked Eye suddenly realized that his chest had become numb. The pain had played itself out, having said what it needed to, and he had withstood it. He had withstood it! Crooked Eye felt elation and the ecstatic feeling of being in the moment for one of the last times in his life. He had overcome the worst pain of his life, and he was no longer afraid. He had conquered his fear as well. He stretched out his arms toward the north and the south and leaned his head back. He cried out, not in pain this time, but in triumph. His hoarse cries reached the people of the canyon, and, coupled with the sight of a man hung on a pole with his arms reaching outward, it struck them all profoundly. Crooked Eye's back was to them, and his body was aligned with the wood he was bound to. To them, it looked like the two had become mingled, and the wooden beam had grown arms. But soon they would be broken from their silence by another sight. Crooked Eye was suddenly struck by images that floated through his mind. He saw a woman, one he had known in passing. She walked with her back to him and her head down. She was bent with age and bitterness, wearily trudging along. She snapped her head around and looked behind her, and Crooked Eye saw her face. And it came to him. Her name was Pale Moon. She was the woman from White Hand's dreams, the one he refused to name. When he spoke of her, the sick man almost shook with emotion, and the dreams were not that terrifying. It would work. It would work because of how strongly White Hand felt, whatever it was he felt. Crooked Eye had heard gossip that said that the father of Pale Moon's son was not killed in battle. He heard the rumor many winters ago. It was no wonder he could not remember before. It was said White Hand had played with the younger woman's heart for her favors and then disavowed her. It was a disgrace for an unwed woman to bear a child, so many supposed Pale Moon had tried to soften that disgrace by saying that she and a man named Dipping Bird had planned to marry. Dipping Bird had just been killed by the Crees, so he could not discount her tale. And the fallen man had indeed courted her, lending credence to her claim. Pale Moon mourned after the man was killed, cutting herself and wailing, so most believed her. But as the child grew, many of those same people had seen his resemblance to White Hand, and they began to think she had mourned so because the real father of her child had rejected her. By then, White Hand was long gone, leaving with his little band because, he had said, he could not abide Tends to Jump as chief. Pale Moon had managed to wed another, but her heart was never made well again. Crooked Eye leaned hard against the skewers and cried out wordlessly once more. He would live. He would live and see Snowbird again and lie beside her. The man, covered in blood and filled with a strange joy, saw the answer that had come to him and marveled at its beauty. He would tell White Hand that his entreaties had been answered. The dying man could not know that the woman had succumbed to the big measles just a summer ago. He would say that he had flown with the spirit of a great bird and seen a woman crouched over an image of White Hand, chanting a death curse. Then he would say the woman's name was Pale Moon. He would remind them that he had said that he could not control the spirits. And then he would say that he could stop Pale Moon's chanting if he was allowed to return to camp. The arguments that would follow played through Crooked Eye's mind, and he found an answer for all of them. What if we let you go, and you let the death chant continue for revenge? You took me once. Could you not do it again? What if you led men back to the canyon to make war on us? Just blindfold me as you did before, and release me close to camp. If we send you back, what assurance do we have that you can even do anything to stop Pale Moon? If you keep me, of this you can be sure. Both White Hand and I will die. The sounds cut the man's inner dialogue short. Boom! Crooked Eye could make no sense of the noises. He heard a gurgling sound, followed a moment later by a distant thud. He heard footfalls and a scuffling sound, and then a series of crunching cracks. He saw men appearing to the north, hordes of them, streaming toward him like a swarm of bees. Crooked Eye felt fear that what he was seeing and had just heard was not of this world, that he was seeing a vision of bee-men flying across the ground, sent to destroy all who were in their path. When they were almost upon him, he understood and yelled, "No!" But it was too late. He felt horrible pain and fell into blackness. One Knee's band began to encounter signs of men and many horses. They followed them the rest of the morning, and not a few in the war party remembered the dream of rides low. They were but 6 men, far afield in country unfamiliar to them. Walks and Blood was about the only one of them who still had his heart in the chase. The rest were only doing their duty to their tribe and chief. They wished they would have turned back before seeing the new tracks. Now, unless all agreed to tell no one that they had found tracks to follow, they had to go on. Such an agreement is always difficult to approach, though a few of the men would look in one another's eyes and ask this question silently: Is Crooked Eye worth getting killed over? The trail they had found ran in 2 directions and was well used. It was probably connected to a temporary camp, further reason for uneasy feelings. What could they do if they stumbled upon a whole camp of enemies? Steal a few horses and hope they themselves were not discovered and slaughtered? The fearful war party followed the trail as it ran southeast away from a rocky creek. They stayed off the trail and moved cautiously, but there was little place they could conceal themselves, let alone their horses. Though the land was spring green, there was little cover such as small ravines, trees, or bushes. It was mostly just a rolling plain they were moving on, and when they reached an upswing in the land, they saw more of the same. With their horses walking beside them, they felt like an inviting target. At least the knife cut both ways. If they could easily be spotted, they could also see trouble coming and have time to flee if outnumbered. They happened on the canyon when the sun was well on its way to its home in the west. After coming over another rise, they saw that water from heavy spring rains had washed away a lot of greenery in a sort of snaking downward path. The brown and green path looped northward around a stand of bushes and trees. The land rose again in that direction, and the men knew that the snake path should not flow that way. Then they heard the cries.
I seek only wisdom. Son, oh son, help. My need is heavy.
The voice was faint and hoarse, and they only caught a word here and there. The men all froze and listened.
Keep me. See my good work. Send one to help. Sick man. Well, alone I am.
The praying voice died away, and the silence held. The men all looked at one knee. Smoke's Deep and Walks in Blood will scout ahead following the water path. We will hold their mounts and wait back over the rise. We must not be discovered. One knee's voice was quiet but insistent. Then should we not wait until dark? Gray Eyes asked in hopeful tones. We have traveled far and spent 2 days on this search. The 2 scouts will go in the light, and if they see superior forces or no sign of Crooked Eye, we will use the night as cover for our journey home. Gray Eyes nodded approval at One Knee's decision. The rest of the men felt the same way. Even Walks in Blood saw the sense in giving up. Fellow tribesmen or not, important shaman or not, they had no other trail to follow, and they had loved ones waiting for them. One Knee looked at Walks in Blood, knowing that Crooked Eye was his friend. The leader saw the young one accept his decision with a nod. Smoke's Deep had no objection to the choice of Walks in Blood as his fellow scout. The man had never spoken to the boy before this trip, and had known him only as most knew him, because of that thing that happened. But he saw him now as a worthy companion. The young man had proven his stamina and ability to move silently. Smoke's Deep didn't know if Walks in Blood could shoot and didn't want to find out. The only way they would put arrow to bow is if cornered and desperate. They moved low to the ground, hiding behind bushes and proceeding carefully. Neither man cared for the idea of being caught on foot by horsemen, but theirs was a mission of stealth. Walks in Blood saw that the dry water path joined a rocky slope. To his left were trees and brush, and the 2 men rushed across open ground for the safety of their cover. They crouched low in the brush and rested. Then they heard the praying man again, and Walks in Blood gestured to Smoke's Deep excitedly, dragging one of his lower eyelids down. The older man nodded his understanding and signed that they should move away from the voice and follow the slope. As he led the way downhill, Smoke's Deep felt disappointment that the boy had recognized the voice as Crooked Eyes. He wanted to go home to his wives and children. But he was a good and dutiful man. He would gather as much information as possible for One Knee. Maybe their leader would still decide to give up on Crooked Eye for lost if they saw a large camp of enemies. Maybe One Knee would let them go home. Walks in Blood's senses were all raised to maddening heights. He thought he smelled horses, and he heard Crooked Eye call out once more. The young man followed Smoke's Deep along the tree line until he saw what they were up against through the brush. Then he crouched beside his companion and used the lesson to calm himself. He became a mere spectator, a recorder of information. He saw over a dozen men, most of whom had guns, and 7 women, all sitting around the cave talking quietly. He looked at the sunken canyon, noting the watermarks on its sides. Oddly, he thought that the canyon would be a bad place to be in a heavy rainstorm, as if he wasn't there and it wasn't a bad place to be on that particular sunny day. There was a small herd of horses tied in one corner. A few lodges were erected on a small rise in the rocky canyon floor. Discarded articles were cast about the canyon. Smokesteep looked at Walks in Blood and marveled at his calm. Maybe the young man was just stupid and didn't understand that they were looking at a band of heavily armed killers, and just the outlaws they could see already had them outnumbered. He put a hand on the boy's shoulder and jerked his eyes and head back toward the way they came, letting Walks in Blood know that they had seen enough. I heard him. He is the man praying, Walks in Blood said. Crooked Eye is there. So is a band of renegades with guns, Gray Eyes countered. The war party was not in a warlike mood as they spoke sheltered behind that ridge. They had greeted the scouts' news with silent, grim faces. Walks in Blood wanted to investigate further, but the rest wanted to call it quits. You may not have been observed this time, but the next sightseeing you do might be your last. Gray Eye's voice was quiet and quick. The shaman might be praying for death while being tortured. He may be your friend, but do you really want to suffer with him? Smokesteep said, a little unwillingly, We have come this far. Our horses are fresh. We can look again, and if we are discovered, we can ride them away, hard and fast. I will abide whatever decision is made. The journey home may be no safer than an attempt at rescue. Who can tell what future lies in either decision? Leaping Calf shrugged and looked at One Knee. Have you anything to say? Sings loud. One Knee wanted all to be heard. He himself did not like the idea of going up against outcasts and killers, but he wanted to save Crooked Eye for selfish reasons. To pull off such a rescue meant respect and women. It would be a thing of power, a great deed and good medicine for future campaigns. Still, he wanted to lead willing men, men who would hold their ground. Sings Loud had always liked hearing stories of bloodshed and scalp-taking, but now was different. Now he was in the story, and who could say whether someone at this time tomorrow would be weaving a tale from the taking of his scalp? He had been in conflicts before, but not against superior numbers. He was a young man, not a hardened warrior like One Knee. He hid his fear as well as he could. Good sense tells us we should go home now, but I will abide your decision, One Knee. To Sings Loud and Gray Eye's chagrin, One Knee said, I believe we should at least see the man for whom we have traveled so far. If Crooked Eye is indeed dying or beyond hope or surrounded by even more enemies, we will have to give him up. But we need to know for sure. As it stands now, what will we tell our people? We heard our shaman but didn't see him? How will that sound? One Knee led them north along the trail to the creek. He wanted their horses freshly watered if his war party needed to ride them non-stop in a long flight. He sensed tension in the other men and felt it himself, but to him the tightened gut and nervy pent-up feelings were like a pinch during coupling, an added pain that made the pleasure sweeter. He knew, one way or another, something significant was about to happen. A tale was about to be added to his already long life story. What did it matter if it be an unpleasant one? Were not the bad, even horrific tales the best ones, the ones most told? But he was old and had lived a long and varied life, seeing both the good and the bad. He was not insensitive to the young ones, like Walks in Blood, who was only a boy. As they let their horses wade in the creek, he broke the silence. Take heart in this. Our enemies do not know of us yet, and these horses have not been ridden in a long time. We have those two advantages over them. And I will not risk your lives unless the situation calls for it. If they are more than us, or even if they are few and get wind of us in time to alert the men our scouts saw, we will waste no time putting space between them and us. I throw my oath to the sun in this." Even the older men were comforted upon hearing One Knee's words, though some took a different view about risking a young life as opposed to an old one. Gray Eyes, for one, thought that dying after living long enough to gain a name and property was much worse than dying young. What did one like the tall boy with the marks have to lose? A few weapons and a young horse? Why wouldn't he risk his neck to save his friend? The young one had much to gain, and if worst came to worst, he would lose a life hardly begun. He wouldn't lose winters and winters of hard work in building a name, gaining a herd and wives, and just plain surviving through sickness and war, hunger and strife. His would be the mosquito life, over before he even understood what life was and what he stood to lose. Gray Eyes looked at Walks in Blood, thinking he understood the boy's calm demeanor and easy steps from the water. Walks in Blood stood beside his pony and looked in Crooked Eye's direction. He could not see him, even though during the course of their journey he had discovered that his eyesight was far superior to those of his companions. He studied the land and saw what looked like a small hill that rose at a sharp angle. Before the hillside, the land dipped slowly, and there were patches of trees that might provide cover. He would stay in the place with no time as long as he could. It seemed that each time he went there, not only was it harder to come back, but he wanted to come back less. People were about the only thing that could bring him back. Since Brightwater had laid claim to him, she kept him from wandering in the place for too long, except when they were coupling, of course. But when their love-making was finished, she could draw him back to laugh and talk with her. Early on, he had realized the danger of spending too much time in the place. After he had learned the lesson of the bear, he had once forgotten his age. Blue Horse had laughed at him and said that he had an idiot for a son, one that didn't know he was 14 winters and not 13. Walks in Blood knew he was not simple-minded. He had just been too long in the place with no time, the place where a moment can be a day, and a day a whole handful of days. The seasons had changed for him during that time like the moon had changed for others. In this way, the place was dangerous. It could swallow your life the way a serpent swallows an egg. But it was only practical for him to pitch his lodge there now, at a time of such tension and danger. The men had already reached the base of the hill, and Walks in Blood saw that it was indeed steep, but not small. The party had gone back southeast where the land began its ascent. They did this to make sure they would not be discovered by any men that might be with Crooked Eye. As they moved slowly alongside their horses, they began to hear the praying man again. Walks in Blood began to hear another voice, praying in its own way. "I am a wolf, born for battle. I am a warrior. It is my place to die." Sings Loud was in a bad way. He was chanting the words in a whisper over and over again, an ode to calm his fear. "I am a wolf, born for battle. I am a warrior. It is my place to die." The words hissed through the young man's teeth in halting breaths. A couple of the older men looked at each other. They did not want to scold Sings Loud to be quiet. They had felt such fear and knew the pain of it. "I am a wolf, born for battle. I am a warrior. It is my place to die." Walks in Blood wished he could comfort the young man somehow, knowing that without the lesson he might be in similar straits, but he let him alone. Sings Loud might be insulted if a hand was put on his shoulder by a younger man. I am a wolf, born for... Ah! A howl of anguished triumph split the air, and Sings Loud cried out as all the men started. A couple of their horses reared a little and nickered, but both cries of man and beast were blotted out by the unearthly sounding wail. One Knee kept his head and went back to Sings Loud. He signed to him that they needed him to stay where they were now and watch their horses. The others would go up the hill and see what there was to see. The terrified man nodded his head in gratitude. He didn't want to see what could make such a bone-shaking sound come out of a man. It was One Knee, Gray Eyes, Leaping Calf, and Smoke Steep who climbed that hill with Walks in Blood. They all had their bows on their backs, sweating and straining as they crawled on all fours, not unlike the wolves in Sing Loud's chant. It was tricky going, not because of the climb, but because of the need for silence. The hill was one of dirt and rocks held together by wide patches of grass. A couple of times rocks gave way and made noise as they bounced and rolled down the hill. When this happened, all the men tensed and looked up, waiting to see if an enemy would hearken to the noise and spot them. If that did happen, all bets were off. One Knee would not need to give the order to retreat to the horses. The command lived in all of them and would be given the instant they were discovered. One Knee shook his head after one such awful moment caused by a loose rock. He was surprised by his own lack of foresight. What better place to shoot at fleeing men than the top of a hill? But things never came to such an unlucky turn. All the men looked at One Knee as they crouched against the earth at the summit. All had bows in their hands, fitted with arrows. A powerful silence had held since the awful wail. One Knee was in the middle of his men, so he lowered his hand, palm down, and nodded to those in front and behind him. He slowly raised his head over the big rock that jutted out above him. One Knee popped his head back down immediately, not needing to study the situation and certainly not needing to be studied in turn. He gestured excitedly to his men, holding up 3 fingers and then dragging down the lid of his eye. Then he held up the fingers again and mimicked a man shooting a musket. One Knee pointed further west to show that the wail had made the enemy seem closer than they were. As the men followed One Knee and inched along the top of the hill, they had all taken courage from his report. True, the enemy had guns, and they did not, but a gun could only spit death once, while a man could launch a whole quiver of arrows. The guns were most effective at close range, or, as with all weapons, in an ambush. But now they were the ones moving unheeded, waiting to spring their deadly surprise, and the opponent was 3, while they were 5. Walks in Blood felt the excitement and wonderful terror of the moment, but moved along unaffected by it. When One Knee finally halted, he was ready, and before he was about to launch an arrow at a man with deadly intent for the first time in his life, oddly enough, he saw Brightwater's face. He now had someone to lose besides Crooked Eye, but the fear of losing her just made him more determined to fight well and survive. Though he was the only man among the 5 who had not spilled blood, he had no moral problem over killing, any more than any other man he had ever met. Killing was what you did to survive, just another important part of life. One Knee did not need another peek at the men they were about to attack. He looked at his fellows and saw courage in all their eyes, even the young ones. A thrill shot through him as he drew his bow to fullness. The other men followed his example, and as they all rose over the top of the hill, another searing, ecstatic cry tore into their ears. Walks in Blood took in the scene all at once. He saw Crooked Eye tethered to a pole, covered in blood and leaning back hard against the cords that bound him, his face to the sun. The man's mouth was open, his eyes shut tight in his howling. Blood instinctively shot at the enemy closest to him, a big man with a heavy gun held along his leg. He watched his arrow split into 3, striking the man in the arm and side as he faced the tortured man. Movement caught Blood's eye, and he saw a squat man waving his arms and staggering backward, an arrow embedded in his throat. He watched the man back off the cliff and disappear before looking back at the man he had shot. Instead of going down, the man raised an arm with a gun at the end of it and an arrow sticking out sideways like a broken bone. Blood threw another arrow into him, as did Smoke's Deep, but the man still shot at them. Fortunately, the shot whizzed by Blood's ear and did no harm, except this. It brought the young warrior back. Blood froze in terror, and time became very real to him. His heart beat out the agonizingly slow moments that followed. Droslo had been partially shielded by Sharp Elbow and squatting with fatigue. No arrow touched him, and he ran for the old horse that he had tied to a bush. He ran away from the attackers, but Leaping Calf ran more swiftly than he. The small man tackled him just before he reached the horse, war club in hand. The man that was so quirky and funny on the trail bashed Droslo's brains out with the indifferent fury of the true warrior. Leaping Calf took the gun off the shattered man's back and went for his horse. One Knee saw that things had gone well for them and went for his prize. He had watched the shaman straining against his fetters and sought to help him, the way he had helped others at the sun dance. He ran over to him, his men trailing behind him, and when he reached the shaman, the man screamed something at him. One Knee hit him running, adding his weight to Crooked Eye's, and the skewers pulled through. He immediately stripped off one of his own leggings and wrapped it around the sleeping man's torn and bleeding chest. He tied the makeshift bandage around Crooked Eye's back. Then he picked the man up, threw him over his shoulder, and headed back toward the hill. One Knee had his war prize. Smoke's Deep went for Sharp Elbow's gun. He may have spoken against the weapons, but one could be traded for many horses, or 1 or 2 exceptional ones. He looked at the man who had managed to get a shot off with 5 arrows in him, and stopped before taking his gun. He recognized the dead man. Sharp Elbow had been an old and dangerous enemy of his. He took the man's scalp before taking his gun. Gray Eyes had headed for Sharp Elbow, but had been too slow. He cursed his luck and the man who supposedly hated guns, Smoke's Deep. Then he saw the gun Three Bears had been leaning on and started for it, filled with joy. Blood had finally gotten his legs to move, but was well behind the other booty takers. He looked to his left at Leaping Calf. The man had a gun and a horse. He looked at One Knee carrying Crooked Eye, and as the leader passed him, he put a hand on Blood's shoulder and met his eye. "Well done, Blood. Take something and head as quickly as possible for the horses," One Knee said, his eyes fervid and gleaming. He seemed to think escape was a given, and it bolstered the younger man's courage. Blood saw Smoke's Deep bent over the big man, and then looked at Gray Eyes going for the gun left by the round man that fell off the cliff. He didn't know what to do. The old men were taking everything of value, everything that could be traded for the horses he needed for Brightwater. He looked at the man Leaping Calf had killed, and looked away. His eyes saw nothing of value before his stomach could no longer take the sight. Smoke's Deep had left the big man's body carrying his gun and the bloody locks of his hair. Blood walked up to the once fearsome man that he had shot twice, and noticed a white object sticking out from underneath his side. He put his foot between a couple of arrows and rolled him onto his back. He bent down and drew the dead man's strange knife from its sheath. He was marveling at its weight when he heard the shot. Gray Eyes had picked up the discarded gun triumphantly, forgetting about the men in the canyon. He was close to the edge Three Bears had gone off of, and a remarkable shot from below struck Gray Eyes dead center. The heavy ball tore him wide open and knocked him off his feet. He landed in a heap, as still as a stone. Walks and Blood saw how it was for Gray Eyes and ran toward One Knee where he was poised at the edge of the hill. The young man shook his head and drew his hand across his throat. He had no thoughts of getting his fallen companion's prized gun. All he wanted now was to be home with Brightwater. A few more shots were heard, and even though the angle they were thrown at kept the shots from even having a remote chance of hitting any of them, all the men felt impelled to go down the hill the hard way. Leaping Calf left the old sorrel and hit the slope running. One Knee followed his example, with Crooked Eye still across his shoulder. The leader hit the hill backside first, sliding down fast. Walks and Blood followed One Knee, and he was treated to the bizarre sight of Crooked Eye's limp hands and arms bouncing on the rocks and dirt of the slope, like the doll the girl drags on the ground. The young man was also treated to a few rocks in the privates as he slid down holding the big knife. It was painful, but quick. The men were running for their horses in no time. Sings Loud handed them the reins to their horses, and One Knee threw Crooked Eye over Gray Eye's back, chest first. He had planned on tying the shaman to the dead man's horse, but Crooked Eye woke up screaming. The bloody man, painted white with black dots, squirmed on the horse's back. One Knee took Crooked Eye roughly by the throat to sober him. Pulling the man's head close to his, One Knee said, "You are safe now. If you want to stay that way, sit up and ride with us away from this place." Crooked Eye used his remaining strength to slide off the black and remount him properly. The relief and shock he felt mixed with the pain of his chest, and softened it a little, but not much. He was among friends for the first time in what seemed like ages. His salvation had come twice in the space of a few moments, but the second redemption would scar him forever, if the wounds didn't take poison and he lived. He looked at the men as they waited for him to gather himself, and one of them rode forward, carrying the hated knife of Sharp Elbow. Crooked Eye was stunned to see the boy, Walks and Blood, smile at him and say, "It is good to have you back, Crooked Eye." The young man rode up to him, arm outstretched, and Crooked Eye took it. He and Walks and Blood clasped one another by the forearm, and though Crooked Eye looked for words, all he found was tears. White Hand watched it all from his grotto. He saw Three Bears fall, Droslow's cowardly run, and his own brother's death. His heart beat loudly, and he cried out in grief. But then one of the marauders tackled the shaman, and once White Hand saw that they meant to take his only hope, he grieved no more. With the taking of Crooked Eye, the old renegade died, and a dead man does not grieve. White Hand became an empty shell, watching the rest of it unfold. He saw that one of the attackers was a fool, and he watched one of his men cut him down. Other shots were fired, but none of them found the mark. He saw his people scattering like the ants they were. They would not even give chase to the attackers now that Three Bears and his brother and he were dead. They were the three strongest men. The rest were dogs. "And here comes a dog now," White Hand muttered under his breath. He gathered what was left of his strength and rose from the hides, knife in hand. Gopher Boy had been expecting such a thing for some time. He had seen the old man's killing hatred toward him, and he knew one day he would have to kill the gray hair or die. Gopher Boy was grateful when the man fell ill, thinking that the illness would probably save his young life. He was not stupid. He knew White Hand had probably killed more men than anyone he had ever known or even heard of. He had seen a few of his victims fall firsthand, the death coming so fast the fallen ones died trying to figure out what they had done to bring it about. So even in the confusion that reigned in the canyon that day, the young crow knew better than to pass in front of White Hand's cave without care. Gopher Boy quailed for a moment when he saw the white hand raised against him, the cruel blade flashing in the sun. The white hand had dripped with the blood of so many, for more summers than Gopher Boy had been alive. But the man connected to it was sick and frail. The crow regained himself just in time to dodge the blade and kick the old man's legs out from under him. White Hand fell face first, and before he could get up, he felt Gopher Boy kneel on his back. The young man drew his blade and grabbed the handful of dark hair flecked white and gray. He pulled White Hand's head up and put his mouth close to the man's ear. "You waited too long, old man. You waited too long," he whispered to the renegade chief. Then he cut his throat with delicate pleasure. White Hand felt sharp pain and awful pressure, and he was glad. The crow was a fool. He had given him a great gift. If the bitch boy really wanted to get him, he should have just kicked him in the ribs and left him alone, to die slowly and pitifully. Why couldn't the young fool see that? White Hand felt himself fading, and he also felt the faint pressure on his wrist. He was curious about it, but gave himself over to the sleep that pulled at him. The old man fell into his dark dreams for the last time. And so White Hand died at the hands of a crow, the way his beloved chief of old, Red Knife, had. Under different circumstances, to be sure, but close enough to satisfy the renegade chief. In his own strange way, the man was glad and victorious in death. He got to die in a way he understood and indeed had an intimate knowledge of. He got to die at the hands of another, instead of being consumed by an invisible enemy, one he could not fight. In this way his death made sense to him. Gopher Boy dragged the big, flat rock over to the fallen man. Everyone else had cleared out of the canyon in fear of the killers of Sharp Elbow. He alone was there, and he stayed for a reason he thought worth the risk. He put the rock beneath White Hand's right forearm and lifted the hand axe he had taken from the cave. It was a good metal one, but it still took 3 solid whacks to sever the white hand. Not much blood came from the cut forearm. Most of it had already poured out the dead chief's neck. Gopher Boy carefully wrapped the hand in some trade cloth. He thought to smoke it later, to dry and preserve it. Gopher Boy was sure the renegades he had lived with would not band together again, and he would need all the protection he could get to survive. The terrible hand that had killed so many would be a powerful talisman, great medicine to protect him as he traveled alone in search of a people who would accept him. Each man's medicine is indeed his own.